welcome back to From the Earth to the Moon podcast. I'm Elton, this is Andy as always.
Hello there.
And we have already completed the first 2 episodes of this. We are now on episode 2 of the series, episode 3 of the actual podcast. Weird, huh?
It's confusing. I hope you're paying attention, making notes at home,
I'm trying to make notes, but, they tend to blow out the window for some reason.
No, that is not good at all. Not good at all. Yeah. Let us regain our focus. And I'll tell you what. How about we just go back to the beginning and we'll call this one Apollo 1.
Okay, sounds good to me.
There you go. Nice little segue there. Did you like that?
Yeah,
it was a bit clumsy, but we're going to roll with it.
So we're covering the episode part 2, but it's called Apollo 1, isn't it? So
it is.
This is the episode centered around the Apollo 1 disaster.
Yes, I mean, prior to, so just to people that don't realise, this is about Apollo 1, which was scheduled to be the first manned Apollo mission, and this was going to be it was going to be an orbital flight. The idea was it would go into low Earth orbit, and it was the first orbital test of the Apollo service and command modules, the little gumdrop bit that the astronauts go in.
Yeah, the teeny tiny bit at the very top of them massive rockets.
Yeah, it's that little bit at the top. So this was the first test of a brand new spacecraft, effectively. Prior to this, the Americans had only flown 2 spacecraft, the Mercury and the Gemini, all leading up to this. And with Mercury and Gemini, they only really were expected to stay in space for a few days. The longest one, I think, was 13 days, and that was at the limit of its endurance. This was designed from the get-go to be in space for 2 weeks, something they'd never really done before. Three men in space for 3 weeks. It was going to be a significant step up in what had come before. Prior to this, did you know anything about Apollo 1 or any of this?
Well, I wasn't born at the time, so...
Granted, I'd make a crass comment about you don't look it, so we'll just gloss over that a little bit.
Well, I suppose all I know is from flicking through books and the odd bit on Discovery that you come across. And I suppose because it is so famous, you tend to think you already know all about it. Where the real truth is, you don't know anything about it. And you should really want to dive into it. And that's where I am at this stage. Now, I know this is a dramatization of what really happened. But it's still interesting in the way that this episode flows from the actual disaster happening and then it ended up in like a courtroom drama.
I really enjoyed the way this episode was structured. I thought it was very interesting. It begins with the disaster, but we don't really see any of it until the end. It almost teases the story out. And yeah, I mean, it reminded me a lot. I don't know if you've ever watched, what's it called? Air Crash Investigator?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's called Mayday in the States. And that, they'll look at a crash that's happened and, try and piece together what led to the crash. It felt a lot like one of those episodes.
Yeah, especially when they had all the tables laid out and all the pieces laid out on that table.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And when they're talking about panel 67, bolt 322, 220 pounds of torque, and all repeating it to unscrew. It was very methodical, and also trying to identify what had happened, and as is just the nature in these sort of things, assign blame, which is just it's something that happens in these situations. Someone has to be blamed. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, it's very CSI in its investigation, isn't it? And the way it's laid out as well, because you need something to happen, you need to work a way through that, and then you need a conclusion from that as well. And that's what you get from this episode.
Oh, very much so. And again, you definitely still get that sense of how rushed everything kind of is at this point. I think at this point they've overtaken the Russians, but the race is still very much on. They don't know how far along the Russians are, and there's a lot of pressure to be the first.
I think at this stage, a lot of the pressure comes from within because of the time restraints. Because this happens in 1967.
Oh yeah, this was January 1967. The flight itself was planned for February.
Yeah.
So we're just over 2 years away from the first landing.
Yeah, I think they say later on in the episode as well that they are fighting against the clock, because if they don't make the 1969 December 31st deadline, then everyone's going to lose faith in NASA, faith in NASA and the establishment, and then all eyes will be directed away spacebound.
Well, yeah, they people would lose interest, they'd lose the budget, and it just would never happen.
Yeah.
So this is the story of that mission. I mean, speaking personally, my first real exposure to it, in terms of understanding it, was in the film Apollo 13, because this features at the very beginning.
Yeah.
When you have that little kind of flashback and they're talking about the fire, and there's just a whole bit with Jim explaining to his kid about the fire and stuff there. So it was something I was aware of, but I didn't know a huge amount about. And this episode was very, very good at kind of informing me. Again, I've done research in the time since to try and understand what happened, and there's a few creative liberties taken here and there, but by and large, it is very accurate to what took place here. Yeah. Just for clarity's sake, I think we'll explain the mission wasn't originally designated as Apollo 1. The crew wanted it to be Apollo 1, and as the first manned mission, it was going to be. Yeah. But Apollo had already flown twice unmanned prior to this point, and this was internally designated AS-204, and it was only after the fire and everything and petitioning from the widows that they agreed to name it as Apollo 1. It gets a little confusing because the next flight was Apollo 4, which was another unmanned flight. Apollos 2 and 3 were never officially used, but were kind of retroactively applied to the previous 2 unmanned launches.
Right, okay.
Mm-hmm. So that's where we are with that. The crew of Apollo 1, would have mentioned them now. We had Gus Grissom, Virgil Gus Grissom, who we met a little bit in the last episode, and he was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. Yeah. He flew on Liberty Bell 7, which I think was the fourth. It was the fourth flight of a Mercury. His capsule, when it landed, the hatch blew, and the capsule actually sank, and it was only recovered in the 90s. He nearly drowned. And because of that, at first they blamed him, saying he accidentally blew the explosive bolts. But it later transpired, no, they could explode on their own, which is kind of terrifying when you think this is a spacecraft. But yeah, that led to some changes which directly impacted what happens in Apollo 1.
Yeah, that's right.
In there, not being able to use the explosive bolts. Also with the hatch opening inwards as opposed to outwards to try and prevent that happening. Mm-hmm. And he also flew in a Gemini mission. Which one was he on? It was Gemini 3. So he was the first astronaut to be asked to fly 3 times, and he would have flown every spacecraft NASA had up until that point.
Wow.
So again, he was one of the original Mercury 7. Good friends with Deke Slayton, who was the flight controller, the chief astronaut.
He's a proper American hero, isn't he?
Oh, very much so.
I'm surprised they didn't put him in G.I. Joe.
Okay, so there's Ed White, and Ed White was the first American to walk in space on the Gemini mission.
Yeah.
If you recall last time, there was the jokes about him, you have to come in, and, it's implied that he didn't want to come in because it was having too much fun. Weirdly enough, the person giving him those orders at the time was Gus, who was Capcom. If you remember from last episode.
Yes, I do. Yeah. He also, I've seen a few pictures and some awesome high quality photos that we can find on the Googles.
Oh yeah. On the Wikipedia page for him as well, there's just some really good photos of that spacewalk.
Yeah.
And it's stunning and it's beautiful and it's,
he's taller than what I thought he would be as well. I don't know why that amazes me, but yeah, he seems like a real, he's probably well over 6 foot, I'd imagine.
Oh yeah, I mean Frank Borman mentions that he's big for an astronaut,
right?
Because again, if you think all these guys were test pilots as well, and with test pilots they tend to, I suppose, be a certain size in terms of for injector seats and stuff like that.
Mm. Yeah.
So that was Ed White. And then the last person on board was Ed Chaffee, is it?
Robert Chaffee.
Robert Chaffee,
Roger.
sorry. Yeah.
Roger
B. Chaffee, yeah. And this was to be his first flight in space. I think he came in with the third astronaut group. Yeah, he was part of a third astronaut group.
Yeah. Interesting thing I found out this weekend was that Roger Chaffee, he designed the Apollo patch that they were to wear on their first mission.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah,
I think the astronauts had certainly a say, and because I think Jim Lovell, I don't know if he designed, but certainly chose what he wanted for the Apollo 13 patch.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know how involved the astronauts were in the patches and everything, but yeah, that's very cool, very interesting.
Yeah, see, one thing that you learn when you dive into these sort of things.
Well, that's what we want, always to be learning. And I think that's important. So those are the astronauts. And the test they were doing was what's called a plugs out test. And they do explain what that is in the episode. But the idea here is it's to see how does the spacecraft function when it's disconnected entirely from ground support. So there's no power lines going into the spacecraft. There's no fuel lines. There's no radio lines or anything like that. The spacecraft, for all intents and purposes, is isolated. There's no fuel in the rocket. Mm-hmm. All the explosive bolts and pyrotechnics and everything like that are disconnected. So it's viewed as a very safe test. It's supposed to be everything is inert and there's nothing that can go wrong.
Yeah.
Evidently, that is not the case. But, that's certainly what is portrayed and, how I meant to see it. The beginning of the episode, makes out there's some radio problems going on. I don't know if that is in fact the case. I couldn't find any direct references to radio problems, but it's entirely possible they were having those sort of issues. I think that was just a way to kind of get the audience into the thing. But
I think personally, I had a little scout around, and I'm sure I found a piece on what Gus Grissom was actually saying in the episode about not being able to speak between three buildings and how we're going to speak between Earth and space.
Uh-huh.
And I'm pretty sure that actually happened.
Okay. No, fair enough. Actually, I don't know, but we definitely get the impression this is not going to plan.
Yeah.
It's not. When you think NASA, everything's going to plan, everything's smooth, there's no problems. They're best of the best, everything's always pristine. But it's not the case. This is a experimental spacecraft. These are test pilots, and that's what this is all about. This is a process of testing, and it's just one of those things where you definitely get the impression that NASA was taken. I suppose had forgotten that as well.
Yeah,
you get the impression they were kind of taken aback. They were like, "Oh, we weren't expecting that this could happen."
Yeah, I think it's a lot to do with pressure in this. Mm-hmm. You think about it, looking back on it, you got all of mankind willing them to do well. And even mankind now, still looking back on it, willing them to do well. And that's a huge amount of pressure. And especially when you constrain yourself to a time restriction. Now, if the goalpost had been, if Kennedy had turned around and said, okay, look, we want to put a man on the moon, but instead of doing it in the next 7 years, we'll do it in the next 27 years, then you've got more tolerance there, haven't you?
Well, I'll tell you what, something to bear in mind. I believe every president since Reagan has promised either a return to the moon or a manned mission to Mars.
Yeah.
But it's always in a 20-year time span.
Really? Oh, okay, yeah.
And that's the thing. What happens is, it quietly just gets shunted down the order and forgotten about.
Well, it's also they have at most 8 years in the presidency, don't they?
Yeah.
So, well, I promise you to do it within 20 years, and 12 of them years I won't even be in power.
Pretty much. There's just not the same sense of urgency behind it.
Yeah.
I mean, NASA gets a fraction of a budget it used to get, which is an absolute travesty in my opinion. But that's the nature of it. They'd rather spend their money on nuclear missiles and B-2 stealth fighters. But there you go. No, stealth bombers even. So yeah, that's kind of where we are with that. Something else I just wanted to mention very briefly. This isn't a Saturn V. This is a Saturn 1B.
Which is a lot smaller than the Saturn V, isn't it?
It is a lot smaller. It is in effect only because the Saturn V has three stages to get to orbit. This only has two.
Right.
It has a version of the S2B, and then it has the S4B and the Apollo spacecraft. What's interesting with the S1B, when it launched from Launch Pad 39 with the big rigs and everything like that, it had to stand on what they called a milk stool, which was effectively a gantry to kind of lift it up to the same level as the Saturn V. But this launch...
Right. It needed help.
It needed a box because it was a little short. But this was taking place at Launch Pad 37, which was only used for the S1B launches. I think they used it for this and for the Apollo 7 launch, I think, and then it was dismantled. And the remains are still there. In fact, there is a plaque affixed to the base commemorating the crew of Apollo 1.
Yeah.
And so that's fair. So yeah, I just wanted to mention about that. We see the fire in the thing. It's a very dramatic the way it's done, but at the beginning we don't really get a sense of what's going on. It's like they shout there's a fire. You can kind of see through the window what's going on there, and then there's an explosion as the wall of the spacecraft fails.
Yeah.
Again, I think a little bit of artistic license was taken there. I don't think there was any eruption of flame that threw people away from the spacecraft in that way. But I think that's just to get across to you, the audience, just the level of force that's going on there.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. Otherwise, you'll have a situation where you can see some flames through a window, through a porthole, and nothing else really. You won't have people struggling to open a door or anything like that. It just doesn't scream urgency, does it? I
mean, there was a failure of the wall of the capsule because it did burn through, and there were real worries that the fire might ignite the solid rocket motors in the launch escape tower,
right? Which
was on the bit above there. But that didn't happen. So I again, this is still a dramatization. Certain events are kind of condensed down, things were omitted, people have changed. But just to give you a sense of what actually happened, I don't think that was the case there.
Yeah.
But what was accurate is what they describe is how it took close to 5 hours to get them out of the spacecraft. Because at this time, the spacesuits were made from nylon. And I don't know if anyone is old enough to remember things like the Falklands.
Mm-hmm.
Nylon melts.
Yes.
Nylon is a very nasty substance in a fire. So those spacesuits and a lot of the stuff in the cabin itself, it all kind of melted. So it was it's pretty nasty. I mean, if you go to the Wikipedia page, there's somewhat graphic descriptions of the state of the astronauts. They all had third-degree burns to portions of their body. It does state, though, that they weren't killed by the burns. They all happened post-mortem. They were killed because the fire would melted through their oxygen lines.
Yeah.
And they had died of asphyxiation, effectively.
Yeah.
And small mercies, if you will, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't want to be grim on this.
No.
I'm just wondering whether that's a thing they say.
Potentially. All I would say, though, is this is taken from the official investigation report, and in that they're not going to sugarcoat it to make it better for people, because they need to understand what happened to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I get that. I'm coming from like a kind of personal experience from this. Do I go into this story or not? Okay, yeah, I do. When I was at college, I had some friends who ended up not joyriding. They were just in a car, but ended up spearing into a tree. It twisted the chassis of the car. They couldn't get out. It set fire and they burned alive. Now, the official report turned around and said to everyone that they asphyxiated, whereas passers-by and people trying to smash the windows as they were clawing to get out of them know full well that they did not. Now, I'm just wondering whether this is just a line that they use, just not sugarcoat it or just to dumb it down, or just to ease people's worries.
Potentially, all I would say, and not wanting to take away from what happened to the people in the car, it's pretty clear what happened there. The car hit tree, caught fire, people died. This is within this situation, they'd want to know what caused the actual cause of death, because then that would impact how changes would be made and how things would be improved in the spacecraft. So I think in that respect, it wouldn't do that. You're right. They might have done it and publicly stated it. My mind's taken to things like the Challenger, where at first they were saying, "Oh yeah, they all died straight away," but then it later transpired they didn't die in the Challenger.
Yeah, they were
at least 3 of them were conscious enough to activate their emergency air supplies.
Yeah.
Now, again, a lot of people have said since, they were all alive all the way down until they hit and they could be heard cursing on the radio. That's not the case. And I think that was exacerbated by them initially saying they all died instantly to having to admit that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
But I think with this and Apollo 1, that mindset wasn't installed there yet. And again, something we find out in this episode is NASA is investigating it themselves over the objections of certain members in the Senate and Congress. Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, they would have to be squeaky clean. They couldn't necessarily pull those punches.
No, that's right. And you saying that it burnt through the oxygen lines, so immediately their oxygen is removed from, and they're in a room on fire, which is lacking in oxygen. Really, I know it's high pressure and it has a certain amount of oxygen, but that's just fuel for the fire, isn't it? So they're not going to be able to be breathing that at all. So okay, maybe I don't know. It's just something that crosses my mind every single time.
I can definitely see it's something that potentially could happen. I just don't think in this instance it did happen. But I don't know. I wasn't there. Yeah, we'll just have to do it.
Sorry. So, from what you learned on this, why would it take 5 hours to get them out from this? Is it waiting for it to cool down, etc., or is it waiting for it to be safe and rendered safe?
I don't want to use the term trigger warnings or anything like this, but this is not pleasant to hear. So people who are get a bit squeamish, you might not want to hear this. But the main reason was the suits melted to them and melted to the couches.
Right.
And it's just they effectively had to unbolt or cut around them as much as possible to get it out.
Yeah, well, we know what happens when nylon fuses to nylon in a high temperature situation.
Yeah, and again onto bodies as well. So it's not. I don't think there are any pleasant ways to go, but this is definitely very low on the list.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, it took them a long time to get the guys out of there, and again, you really do get a sense of the level of shock that took place in NASA. There's the bit when Joseph Shea, who's the head of the Apollo spacecraft program, turns up.
Yep.
And you got the flight controller there, and he's just, he goes, "Someone said there's a problem with the spacecraft," and he's just fighting back the tears. He goes, "We lost a crew." What do you mean we lost a crew? And he goes, "They're dead."
Yeah.
They and people just really can't believe this happened. It's like, but this is. It's the equivalent of they went down the road for cigarettes and were killed in a car crash, as far as they're concerned. It's the test they were doing is so unhazardous. Yeah. It doesn't even enter into the equation that it was a problem.
It's routine. It's a day at work and sitting in a chair, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for that to be what killed them, it just comes as a shock. If you know something's dangerous, you can kind of prepare yourself mentally, I think. But it was a huge shock to everyone there. I did just want to mention at this point as well, just so people are familiar, we have Deke Slayton, who is a character who will feature quite a bit in this episode. Now, we mentioned him a little bit last week, but I wanted to just make sure everyone's aware. He was originally slated as a Mercury astronaut to go on one of the Mercury missions, but he was grounded. He had a heart condition, a heart fibrillation, and so he wasn't allowed to fly. So he then became the head of the astronaut office, effectively, but in charge of all the astronauts in terms of their flight assignments and stuff like that.
He's the one that they mentioned about heart palpitations, weren't they?
Yeah, he's that one. Yeah, but he was very good friends with Gus Grissom and the older, the original batch of astronauts, because he came in with those guys as well. So if you recall last time out, we see him speaking to Gus saying, I really want a Mercury astronaut to be part of Apollo.
Yes.
And, he kind of pushed for Gus to be there.
That's
so he's,
right,
he's certainly feeling a certain amount of personal responsibility there.
Yeah, because we saw Gus turn around. Well, it just so happens that I was a Mercury astronaut.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember that. Yep.
I think the thing here is with the Apollo 1 capsule, you're definitely getting the sense, as I've already said, this is an experimental spacecraft. They're doing this in a rush. This is what they call the Block 1 capsule. They'd already made changes for the later ones. Things like the inward opening hatch. Mm-hmm. They didn't like that because it was very difficult to open and to get out, especially when the pressure inside was higher than outside. Now in space, that's ideal. You don't want the hatch accidentally opening when you have higher pressure inside.
That's right.
Because that would be a bad thing. But it does mean like when you land, it makes it very difficult. In fact, I don't think they were able to open it themselves. It had to be opened from the outside. Someone had to open the outer door, I think,
right,
before they could get out. Especially since there was no explosive bolts or anything like that.
Yeah.
And again, it's being built by North American Aviation, who is they were a manufacturer. I think they merged with other companies throughout now to become part of Rockwell. They're now basically part of Boeing, long story short. And, again, there's a lot of pressure on them to build this spacecraft in time, under budget, and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of people trying to meet targets and deadlines, and there's real pressure going on here. And one of the things they discovered during the breakdown of the spacecraft, because, again, they have to meticulously take it apart piece by piece, is they find that there's a socket wrench that's been left in there.
Which, yeah, it adds a bit of fuel to the flames, really, doesn't it? Where people are looking for a blame, I think they're looking for an easy target, easy solution to this problem, and having a socket wrench just resting there, which could have been a problem later on anyway. Mm-hmm. It's a bit embarrassing just having it there, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. I don't know if you recall, though, if you think back to the last episode, Al Shepard's first flight, there was a socket wrench in the Mercury capsule as well.
Was there?
If you recall, when he goes up there, he sees one flying by and he goes, there's a socket floating here.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It happens. And again, I think they mentioned this in the hearings, that you're expecting everyone and everything to go 100% perfect, 100% of the time with an experimental spacecraft under this sort of time pressure. That's just impossible. It cannot happen. Things like this do happen. But yeah, you're right. It's a situation where something's gone very badly wrong. And while that itself isn't responsible, it does point to look, if you've missed this, what else might you have missed?
Yeah.
But then we see the flip side. NASA was turning around to North American, changing the requirements, pushing the boundaries. And also things like with a plugs out test, North American didn't want them to conduct the tests at high pressure. NASA felt they had to do the tests at high pressure to simulate the environments they wanted. So there was a big back and forth of, you're to blame, no, I'm to blame, no, you're to blame, that sort of thing going on there. Yeah. I don't think it was necessarily trying to absolve anyone of blame. I think it was more this sense of trying to understand as quickly as possible what happened to make sense of it. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Can we just go over the high pressure situation? Because
sure.
I've written down all the numbers and I understand what they're trying to do. I'm not saying people wouldn't grasp it, but I just found it interesting that they would, they would work like that. So they when they're going to be in space, they're going to be working at £5 per square inch, aren't they?
£5 per square inch of pure oxygen.
And that would be up in space?
Yes.
And it would be pure oxygen as well, would it?
It would be pure. They would breathe pure oxygen.
Right. I always thought they dropped it down to like 60% or something like that.
Okay. Do you have the numbers, and then we'll talk about what came out afterwards?
No, yeah, okay. But so they're at sea level, and on the outside of the ship, you have a lot more pressure forcing in, whereas in space you wouldn't have any pressure forcing inwards on the ship.
Yeah.
So they have to increase that, and they have to increase it up to 17 pounds per square inch.
Yeah, I don't know if these numbers are accurate, but they state in the show that at sea level, the atmosphere is 14 psi.
Yeah.
So to simulate the 5 psi positive pressure inside the spacecraft, you have to increase it to, I may go for 17.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I just found it, didn't even think about it at the time, and then you realise, oh, hang on, okay, and then you're doing 100% oxygen as well. And we all know that oxygen is highly flammable.
Oh, yes.
And it was also very interesting for them to do the Velcro test as well.
Well, I never realised, the Velcro burnt like that. I mean, as you can see at normal atmosphere, it'll burn, it'll melt, but that's it. Whereas at higher pressures of pure oxygen, it would literally explode.
Which was kind of that.
Neither. It's not something that really comes up in everyday situations. I can tell you that after the one of the changes they made after this is the spacecraft was changed. So at launch, it would take off with a 60-40 oxygen-nitrogen mix.
Okay.
And then what would happen is gradually they have small vents. It would vent out that atmosphere while replacing it with a pure oxygen environment once it was in space.
Right.
To get to that right PSI. And I think that, that was in a direct response to this to try and prevent anything like this happening again. So it would effectively cycle its air once it was on its way to the moon, so it would never happen again.
Yeah. And it was that tit for tat as well, wasn't it, where they said they stipulated how much Velcro they wanted inside the capsule, and the astronauts all wanted something so they could put a pencil down, and so they could turn around and still find the pencil exactly in its place where they left it. And so they wanted Velcro not all over the cabin, but in certain parts. And so it was stipulated it's not allowed to be 4 inches from a source of ignition, where I think they state in the program, it doesn't really matter if it's 4 inches or 10 inches or anything like that. If you've got a source of ignition, then it's going to go up anyway. So it doesn't matter how much they got in there.
The original plans, and again, I'm just going on what we say in the show, was to have no more than 500 feet of Velcro? And
yes.
in the end, it had 5,000.
Yeah.
And that's a lot. But what's interesting here is NASA has issued one thing, and then its astronauts have turned around and done another, or requested another. Again, these are test pilots who are, perfectly capable of going and speaking to the guys building the spacecraft themselves and saying, we need this, we need this, we need this, we want this changed. And I definitely think there was a certain amount of overlap and cross communications, because we get the impression that Gus himself, and again, he's flown in Mercury and in Gemini, was wanting lots and lots of changes done to the spacecraft to make it, a better spacecraft in his estimation to do the job.
Yeah.
Whereas, North American are trying to get this and all the rest of the Block 1 spacecrafts ready for flight and starting work on the Block 2s, which were incorporating some of the changes and stuff like that. So, but again, there's a lot of pressure coming in, and it's just a situation where if you're not careful, it'll run away with you. Yeah,
well, I think we heard at the very end of the episode as well, when they're in the court drama situation where we have Frank Borman, I think it is.
Yeah, Frank Borman, who is went on to be the command module pilot on Apollo 8.
Right, okay. He was in there and he was saying that the guys almost had access all areas to where they were building this, and they were going up to, Chaffee went up to one of the guys and who builds all this sort of stuff, and just sat there and spoke to them for a little while, and it made them feel bloody good. And these guys have that access where they can go up to the people making these things and request certain things and suggest certain things, because they're the guys who are testing it. So they have a lot of weight of influence on that, don't they? It's not like me going up into, I don't know, let's pick a car manufacturer, I don't know, McLaren, and saying, well, yeah, I think you need bigger cup holders. And they'll just look at me and go, nah, yeah, all right. But if you've got like the test driver saying, well, you know, I think you need to make these cup holders a little smaller, they'll look at them and go, yeah, okay, fine. Remove all the cup holders. Brilliant.
So, something along those lines, quite possibly, yeah.
I can only dream, man.
I was going to say, I don't think the McLaren F1 cars have cup holders. If they do, that might explain a lot.
Well, you never know, do you? You just never know.
So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of a situation we had there. There's a lot of politics at play. You know, North American want to keep a contract. NASA wants to make sure they get to the moon and everything goes all right. And the loss of life is a tragedy, but they need to keep the program going as well. So again, there's a lot of politicking going on. You know, that kind of. At one point, you know, they basically make their recommendations saying effectively North Americans to blame. North Americans say, no, we're not to blame, but we're going to take the blame because it means we get to keep making the capsules and, you know, we'll be fine. So, you know, it's a less than ideal situation, but it's just part of the realities of doing something like this, I suppose.
Yeah, like you say, it's politics, isn't it? It's just, okay, we know we're not to blame, but we kind of have to admit it, just so there is someone to blame in the public sector. And people have a bad man. People always want a bad man, don't they? Or a bad person or a bad company or someone just to point the finger at. And then
if I could quote from Scarface, you'll need people like me so you can point your fat fingers and say, that's the bad guy.
Oh, see, now I want to see Scarface again.
So
imagine him in an astronaut suit as well.
I'm picturing him on mission control, to be honest. But yeah. So I mean, yeah, but that's basically what's going on there, and we see that as well with Walter Mondale in the Senate hearing. Mm-hmm. Now, Walter Mondale, I don't know if people will remember. I mean, it was a little bit even before my time, but he ran to be president in 1984. He did. He failed, but you know he went up against Reagan. But you see here he's very much against the Apollo missions. He thinks they're a waste of time, waste of money, and he can think of better things to spend the money on. Basically,
I can see that point of view. I've got no problems in people having that point of view at all. Mm-hmm. It's not that I agree with it, but I'm more than happy for people to have that point of view.
My issue with him is I agree with you. It's fine to have that point of view, but he doesn't see this. At least it doesn't come across as he sees this as a tragedy or a health and safety thing. He sees it as an opportunity to kill it.
Yeah,
and you know he comes across as a massive dick as a result. Fair enough. You know that again. We need another bad guy.
Well, yeah, and I suppose you got him against James Webb, of all people.
Yeah. Again, you know we've got the NASA administrators, you know, there, and I think the shocker here is, you know, they're both Democrats, and there's a certain amount of party loyalty. We should both be on the same side here. Politics wasn't as partisan at the time as it is now, but you know, again, it's still, as he says to James Webb, he goes, look, at the end of the day, I have things that this money could spend that would help me politically, and that's what I want. So,
yeah,
that's just the nature of that there.
Yeah. Well, in that courtroom scene, NASA and North America take a kicking from them as well, don't they?
Oh yeah, but they have to. You got to take your punches. Mm-hmm. Someone has to be seen to. It's in this story, or in any story like this, someone has to be seen to be at fault, and to justice has to be seen to be served. People don't like it if that isn't the case. So you also get a situation where people are using it for political gain. You know, they think it's a chance for them to be in the spotlight, to be seen as asking tough questions and to trying to get to the truth and stuff like this. if people want a good example where you can see this, someone using something like that for political gain, Ayrton Senna, when he died, the investigation into that ran on for a whole lot longer than it should have done because an Italian prosecutor saw it as a chance to become famous.
Yeah.
And
well, it went on for years, didn't it?
It went on for years when it should have gone to bed, but a particular Italian prosecutor thought, no, this will make my career. I'll become famous for this. So it just got dragged on. But I think what you see here, and it certainly was, I think, in the way the chairman effectively railroads Walter Mondale and realizes what has to be done to make sure that the Apollo will continue, sidelines him, which I love when he goes, I've got a couple of questions. Do you mind? And Walter Mondale goes, actually, I've got thanks. I knew you would. And he's just like, okay.
The thing about that, though, they got like a speaking light, haven't they? And so he's got the power on the light.
Yeah.
You just see the light blip off. And you're like,
he's got the talking pillow, so
exactly.
It's mine now. Something I wanted to mention as well. I don't know if you realize this, but one of the NASA administrators who's doing the talk, he's playing a character here. Let me just find his name because I made a note of it here. George Muller, who is an associate administrator, is played by a character called Joe Spano, who played, I think, James Webb in Apollo 13, or he played a NASA administrator. Anyway.
Okay. I will give you another fact about that as well. You ready?
Okay, then. I like facts. Give me a fact.
Well, the actor that was playing Frank Borman. It's David Andrews. In Apollo 13, he plays Pete Conrad.
Did not realize that.
There you go.
We're learning. I mean, we did mention at the beginning there was a certain amount of crossover between Apollo 13 and this, but yeah, I love little details like that. It is a bit of a shame they're not playing the same characters, but
a bit of a shame. They must be sat over the other side of the room going, I was him. That's my character. No, it's wrong. It's just wrong.
Yeah, we need Tom Hanks back playing Jim Lovell. But,
oh, no, that was never going to happen, I don't think.
No, never mind. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I suppose, the story of what happens up to the courtroom thing. I mean, again, I really like that Frank Borman has given the chance to speak on behalf of the astronauts. It's I think the guy's name was Senator Anderson, who was
the guy that took the speaking light.
The guy who took the speaking light.
Yeah. I'm going to get one of them in my house, by the way.
Absolutely. You can use it to turn off people's Wi-Fi when we're not meant to be using it. Clinton Anderson was his name.
Yeah.
And he was the chairman of the Senate committee. I like how he gave Frank Borman the chance to speak for the astronaut corps, but then also to ask, what do you think the actual astronauts would say if they were here? I also just like how he said, can you describe what they're like? He was talking about how Gus was, he may come across as a moody bastard because he was a moody bastard, but, he loved everything about being an astronaut except for the fame. He just loved to fly and to do that sort of stuff. And how Roger Chaffee, as you say, when he went to see the guys building the spacecraft, he wasn't actually speaking to people building the spacecraft. He was talking to people who were building the tools to help build the spacecraft.
That's right, yeah.
And no one ever pays them any mind at all. But he went over there and made them feel like they were the single most important members of the entire program. And again, that kind of speaks highly to his character. You speak about Ed Wright, and his first flight, his first moonwalk, and the story about, some say he stayed out longer. Well, it's a good story, but he'd never do that. He'd never disobey an order. He was, straight-laced. He's a West Point man, which, to people of a certain ilk, that speaks to, all those qualities they want to, see in a good military officer and everything.
Yeah, well, in defense of him, in the previous episode, Ed White was out on his spacewalk, and there were, in inverted commas, radio communication problems.
It's true. Yes.
Yeah.
They need the soup cans and some extra long string.
That's right. Yeah.
And I really like, when he says, what do you think they would say? And he goes, well, look, I can't speak for Ed White and Roger Chaffee, but I can let Gus speak for himself. And he had the speech that he'd given saying that, I can't remember the exact words, but, the conquest of the frontier of space is worth the risk of human life. It's a worthy endeavor. And, we're happy to be a part of that. We're willingly willing to be part of that. And again, I like how after that, he's like, oh, okay, that's great. Yeah. Back to you, Walter. And he's there like, no further questions. It's just like, you railroaded me. Well done. I'll get you next time, Gadget. Next time.
There's no coming back from that, is there? It doesn't matter. Anything you say will not alter the decision of everyone's thought in their brain right at that moment.
Yeah. I mean, you still see, though, that sacrifices have to be made. So we have the guy from North American. What was the guy's name? It was... I can't find it.
That's the anyway, I didn't write down.
Always the way. Oh, there you go. Harrison Stormy,
that's right.
Yeah. Basically, he is... He's moved out of the spacecraft program. He's still a VP, but he's fired in all but name. Mm-hmm. He's kind of moved out. He's the sacrificial lamb. Someone has to be held ultimately responsible, and they chose him. So it's kind of a touching moment where he's upset, with his wife. He's like, I'd hoped I'd be able to see it through to the actual landing.
Yeah,
and you can really see how much that has hurt him there. There's also Joseph Shea, who was the head of the spacecraft program, who throughout keeps saying how much he wishes he was in the spacecraft. In a really, I think the most clunky bit of dialogue in the thing, everyone seems to assume he means he's suicidal.
Mm.
In this, it says, oh no, if I was there, I could have put it out of the fire. Now, I looked up on this, and apparently he did have a nervous breakdown.
Oh, did he?
He did. And they did, in effect, move him to Washington so he wouldn't be a part of a program, so he would be out of that line of fire. And basically was never the same afterwards. So I do think that's apocrypha. I don't think that is the case. And it feels very clunky the way he keeps saying, oh, if only I'd been in a spacecraft. And everyone looks at him funny like, no, I don't want to dive. Oh, never mind. I'm not going to explain that line to you.
Yeah, also, I think if he was in the spacecraft, I don't think he would have been able to put it out.
I don't think so either. But it's just, it felt very clunky, that bit being in there.
Yeah.
I can understand. But, and again, you can kind of see that he also is sacrificed, if you will. So the two guys who were the most vocal in blaming the others in that initial meeting both end up losing their jobs.
We get a nice moment as well from them, because we see them sitting around with the astronauts as well, speaking about what they want. And it's one of them black and white montage bits, isn't it, at the very end?
Well, it's a nice little moment of bonding, I suppose, between them.
Reflection as well.
Yeah. And what happens is they give them a photo, and this is a real photo, and you can see it on the Wikipedia page, of the three astronauts with a model of the Apollo 1 capsule praying. And on the photo, it says, it's not that we don't trust you, Joe, but this time we've decided to go over your heads.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fun little, touch. Although, again, it kind of does speak to, they have these concerns. Maybe things should have been done differently. But again, you're in a situation, they're in this race, things are going to slip, and that's just the nature of it. Something we haven't really spoken about, but I did like, was the portrayal of the wives and how each of them dealt with the news differently.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think in these sort of programs, you always have to have the tale of home as well, don't you? And it normally happens in war movies, doesn't it? It's normally the yellow letter that turns up, via a taxi, and or someone standing at the end of the path, and you do kind of get that in certain points, but it is also other wives turning up to the wives and just standing there, and you kind of know straight away, but you don't want to say it, otherwise it becomes real. And yeah, I think you needed that during this.
Oh, very much so. But I think it was important to see how, and again, remember, Grissom had been in space twice already. his wife was kind of used to this, I suppose. And she's, sitting there with the cigarette. Do you want a sedative? No, I've got a lot of tough decisions I need to make. I need to be strong. You've got Ed White's wife waiting for Chaffee's wife when she comes home with a kid. And, they kind of do that non-verbal communication where everything is said, but no words are spoken.
Yeah.
And there's some really good show of emotion there. But the moment I like the most with them all is at the end where they all come together and they want to make sure that the spacecraft will still be called Apollo 1, not out of any kind of ego thing, but it's to make sure they're not forgotten. If you say it was mission AS204, it doesn't mean anything. But if it's Apollo 1, that resonates, and people will remember it. And they want to remind Deke that these guys were his brothers, his kin, and they have the astronaut pin.
Yeah.
Now, again, slightly apocrypha here, because my understanding is when you complete astronaut training, you're given a silver pin regardless. You get the gold one when you actually go into space.
Oh, okay.
So I imagine he would have already had the silver one, but I suppose the gold one is, taking it up with him would be a way of saying, as far as we're concerned, you've done the whole shebang. And he did actually make it up into space in the end. In any event, he was part of the Apollo Soyuz missions, which happened after the last Apollo landing.
Right. Okay.
But it was a nice moment with him and wives, and just kind of, showing how much he meant to the rest of the crew there.
Yeah. Can I just go on a little bullshit rant as well, by the way?
By all means, we like a good rant.
Okay. Well, I was watching like a conspiracy program during the week. I don't know if you know where I'm going with this, but
I can guess.
There was a bit where I found about Buzz punching one of these guys. He's a massive conspiracy nut.
Yes. And
it's pretty famous, and it just made me chuckle. It always makes me chuckle when I see conspiracy nuts get punched in the face. It's heartwarming. It gives you a little ready Brett glow, I feel.
Yes.
And there was also speak of the Apollo 1 was not an accident. It was on purpose by NASA, who they were trying to cover up going to the moon.
Right.
And it really wound me up. I was like, no, this is bullshit. And then they had Gus Grissom's wife come on, and she didn't turn around and say that they covered it up, but I think her words were used in this conspiracy thing to turn around and say, well, we haven't really got a finite definition of what actually happened. Now, I'm guessing she just didn't get the report in the post. Whereas I just didn't understand why it was shoved in there. I don't think she would have been on that page of conspiracy.
Oh, I definitely think that, words were being taken out of context. She might have just meant that she felt they never actually got to the bottom of exactly what caused the fire. Yeah. Or she might have been suggesting that more people should have been held responsible. People should have been charged with manslaughter or something akin to that. Yeah. Because the capsule itself was fundamentally flawed. I mean, they never flew a crewed Block 1 Apollo. Basically, they said those capsules were unsafe, so they used them for testing. But they the only crewed Apollo ones were Block 2 ones with the outward opening hatch.
Yep.
And stuff like that. So it might be something like that again. Things like that. People loved. I mean, again, when you see these wankers going on about the 9/11 conspiracies, and they like to point at the picture of a Pentagon with a hole and saying, "Oh, where's the debris of the bloody thing?" They'll always use a particular image I've seen before. It's cropped. You see the full image. There's a bloody landing gear leg to the left of a bloody thing.
Oh, is there? Okay.
Yeah, it's just like, for fuck. I mean, yeah, this is why I have no time for conspiracy theorists at all.
How about, guys, people just hijacked a plane?
Yeah, I mean, and now we get into this bollocks about flat Earth conspiracies and stuff.
I love them guys. They're brilliant.
No, they're not, because it's because of people tolerating people like that is why we have things like Brexit and Trump. I'm not going on a rant about it, but it fundamentally is.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go down that sort of avenue.
No. I'm going to pull it back. I suppose a couple of things I just thought people might find interesting. The actual spacecraft, it still exists. NASA have it in storage. It's never been displayed or anything like that. However, they did they have now displayed the hatch from Apollo 1 alongside remains from Challenger and Columbia in Kennedy Space Center. There was some talk about it being entombed in the remains of Launch Complex 34, but I don't think they're going to do that. Right. I don't think it will ever be displayed, and rightly so. But it is kind of comforting to know that it still exists in a strange way.
I heard that it was in a military warehouse.
It's in a NASA warehouse. It's a climate-controlled facility at the Langley Research Center.
I wonder if there's people that actually have access to that and walk past it on a weekly basis.
I imagine it's probably in a large wooden crate being looked after by top men. Something which I thought was strange that we didn't actually see in the episode is Gene Kranz gave a speech after this. And I'm just going to read you. I'll read it for you verbatim. It goes, "From this day forward, flight control will be known by two words, tough and competent. Tough means we are forever accountable for what we do or what we fail to do. We will never again compromise our responsibilities. Competent means that we will never take anything for granted. Mission control will be perfect. When you leave this meeting today, you will go to your office and the first thing you will do there is to write tough and competent on your blackboards. It will never be erased. Each day when you enter the room, these words will remind you of the price paid by Grissom, White and Chaffee. These words are the price of admission to the ranks of mission control." And this was also repeated after the Columbia disaster to remind people of that. And given, how Gene Kranz is portrayed in Apollo 13, you can definitely see why he has that, failure is not an option.
Yeah.
Mentality there, and I was a little surprised we didn't see that in this episode, just given how I suppose iconic it is within the ranks of NASA.
Oh, that would have sat well, wouldn't it, as well?
I think so. I suppose the only other thing worth interesting is the Saturn 1B they were going to use actually did fly. It was used for the Apollo 7 mission, which Apollo 7 actually flew the mission Apollo 1 was going to do. So it was the first manned orbital test of the Apollo spacecraft.
Right.
So, yeah.
One thing I wanted to touch on, the actual fire themselves, because they show what actually happens in the cockpit, don't they? Or as best as what they work out anyway in this dramatization. And what I noticed this time round, because I think this was the second time I've seen this now that I know of, and it's all black and white at the very beginning. It starts off black and white. And then as soon as the sparks start flying and the fire ignites, then it goes to colour. It's just I thought it was a really beautiful touch and really eye-catching, because then it's as if the black and white stuff is very procedural and a time before the accident, and then the fire brings it all to light and it's a time after the accident.
I can definitely see that. I think the entire way, because again, one of the nice things with this series as a whole is each episode is kind of structured differently. Each director kind of has a chance to give it its own flair. I'm just going to see who actually did direct this episode, if there's anyone famous. It was directed by David Frankel, who did nothing but immediately. Oh, you know what he did do?
Go on.
He directed Marley and Me.
Now, we all know that is one of the greatest movies ever.
Well, there you go. Now you know why it had such an impact on you.
Oh, man.
But it's really, really well structured, and it's interesting. Each episode of the series feels very different. With Band of Brothers, each episode feels much the same as another episode, with a couple of notable exceptions, whereas each one of this feels very different. In my recollection, anyway. Yeah. I could be proven wrong as we go along.
No, that's good. I honestly, overall, because I think we've discussed it fully, really, haven't we?
Yeah, I think so.
I thoroughly enjoyed this. This was really eye-opening. It made me look at stuff and try and note down pieces, and I've actually learnt from this episode. I think this was fabulous.
Oh, absolutely. I think this it's such a well-told story of a tragic event.
Yeah, I think they got it across on the screen very, very well. You don't feel, well, you feel sorry for the astronauts and the families, but you don't feel sorry for, well, not anyone else really. I don't know. There's so many mixed emotions on this, because I'm not going to say it got dusty at the end, but yeah, there was a kind of lump in my throat towards the end. It's like, oh man, what if?
It definitely conveyed the gravitas of what's going on, both on the personal level for the astronauts and their wives, but also as part of this grand mission to the stars. So I think it balanced all of those exceptionally well.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think this could have been the first episode of a series. You needed that grounding with the first episode, Can We Do This? But this was a fantastic introduction to the Apollo program, and really does show how it started in tragedy.
Yeah.
One last thing I'll say, just because I know I've spoken about this in the Apollo 13 mission, it was as a result of this that Gunther Wendt was assigned as part of the Apollo program.
He's the guy that shakes everyone's hands as they go in, isn't he?
Yes, he was the he was the last person to see. He effectively would run the pad. And I think we see him in the next episode, so I'll speak more about him then. But yeah, it was as a result of this, and the astronauts basically saying they wanted Gunther back, but he comes back.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it there, really, isn't it?
I think so. I think we've certainly touched upon everything. Again, we're not doing these podcasts as this happened and then this happened and this happened. Go and watch the episode. It's fantastic. There might be a link in the Facebook group. I couldn't possibly comment on that, but it's entirely possible there might be one there. But I think it's well worth your time. Go buy the DVDs. It's fantastic. And you know what? Let's all start harassing Tom Hanks and HBO on Twitter and get them to release this on Blu-ray, because it deserves it.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
Especially with the 50th anniversary coming up next year.
Man, yeah, okay, right. I'm all over that later on then.
Excellent.
I'm going to get blocked by Hanks.
Now that is something to be proud of.
Yeah, the nicest man in show business blocks you. Oh, damn, what does that mean? Anyway, so the next episode is We Have Cleared the Tower. And I've seen this. It's a very different episode from what I remember. This is a documentary type episode, isn't it?
Yeah, this
almost like found footage, but not.
Yeah, it's almost like we're seeing the rehabilitation after the fire. Again, it's been a while since I've watched it. I'm looking forward to it, but we'll see where we go. But yeah, this is the Apollo 7 mission. So
excellent, good. Looking forward to that. So, is there anything that you'd like to plug to the nice ladies and gentlemen that we're speaking to at the present?
Oh, well, if you enjoy the sultry sound of my voice, you can usually find me with Elton here on a variety of podcasts, which are on rogue2media.com. Or you can find me on The Great Derelict, where I talk about everything and anything to do with science fiction. We've just done one about Star Trek Discovery, which is fantastic. You should all go and watch that show and then listen to the podcast. There's also one with me and Elton geeking out all about the SpaceX and the Falcon Heavy. Yes, lots of space and science fiction-y stuff there. So go check it out.
Good stuff. And you can also find me on the Black Dog Podcast as well. Please pop along to blackdogpodcast.com, or there's a Facebook group, and it's all over the iTunes as well. So pop along, give everything that you listen to a rating on iTunes, especially this one as well. Why not? Just help our imaginary ladder. It opens the scope for other people to listen to us. So please, we would be very appreciative if you do that. So, until next time, thank you very much, Andy, for joining me.
Oh, you're quite welcome, sir.
And look forward to doing the next episode next time out. And, see you later. Bye-bye.
I should go.